o'clock somewhere here in Central Time. And we've got folks joining us here. We're up to about 50 of us online right now. And I'm hoping that everyone can hear. Hey, Allison, are you listening? Can you hear me? She says she's getting an echo. All right, all good. Hello to all of you. So many of you I know who've joined us, and I'm so grateful that you're here. This is Conversations That Matter from Baptist News Global, and I'm Mark Wingfield, the new Executive Director and Publisher at B&G. And I'm thrilled to introduce to you 5 panelists who hopefully you've read about on the way, so I'm not going to give you all their details. That will certainly come out along the way. But Doyle Hamilton is coming to us from Marietta, Georgia, and Grace Freeman is coming to us from Dunwoody, Georgia, I believe, right?
Yeah, correct.
And Kathryn Keller is coming to us from elsewhere in Dallas. I also am from Dallas, and Eric Minton is coming to us from Knoxville, Tennessee.
You nailed it. Yeah, that's right.
And Brad Schwall disappeared for a minute. I don't know what happened to him. There he is. He's sideways. Brad's also here in Dallas, and you can read about that. This event is being recorded, and we will be posting this later so we can share it with everyone. Thank you for being a participant in this, and thank you for reading our site at baptistnews.com. One of the people on the line here with us at the seminar is Jacob Topper. Jacob is a pastor in Norman, Oklahoma, and a dear friend of mine. About 4 weeks ago, Jacob wrote a piece about a pastor's mentoring group that he's part of, a cohort. And I believe the story was that out of the 8 people on that call, 3 of the pastors admitted that they had actually been thinking of ways to kill themselves during the pandemic. And so Jacob wrote about that and some of the warning signs and some ways to help all the way around. And I will tell you that is the 3rd most read article on our website for all time. It is phenomenal, the response to that. And Jacob's heard from hundreds of people who've written to him directly out of that. And I think that and many other things illustrate the crazy time we're in and the duress of that. So that's why we're doing this. It's just a way to extend the conversation in a more personal way. This is not group therapy. This is a conversation. And during the course of the thing, if you who are attendees would like to put a question in the Q&A box, I'll be monitoring that as we go. But I want us to begin by asking each of our panelists, what are some changes that you have seen in the people you counsel during the pandemic? So what's different now than say on, March 14th, before things really got going? If you think about earlier, before pandemic and now, for your experience, what has changed? And y'all just go in whatever order you want to.
I'll go ahead and start. We have around 40 therapists and psychologists at the center, and they're spread out from McKinney down to Waco, so really north and central Texas. And in many ways, an uncovering of stresses happen because we can use our busyness, we can use our involvement, we can use the hurriedness of life in many ways as a mask for hurt. And so on the one hand, there was stress from the isolation, stress from financial uncertainty and struggle, but also this opening up of other stresses when all of the other aspects of life that sometimes can distract us from those challenges really were lifted. So certainly our clients, we work a lot with children, and so a lot of questions about kids who maybe already had anxiety, then their anxiety increased. And so I would say that would be the last change that we saw, or last difference. Whatever depression was there or anxiety was exacerbated by what is happening.
Thank you.
I agree with what Brad's saying, and my experience is if there's a pre-existing condition, whether it's depression or anxiety, it just seems to accelerate or, as Brad said, exacerbate the symptoms. You know, COVID-19 has been an isolating process. And think about people that are grieving. Think about the rituals of worship that we all, I miss worship. I miss public worship. We've lost a lot of those rituals of community. So the isolation is a major problem.
The first of the year, I had taken a new assignment where I was going to be starting a chaplaincy program in the cancer centers, the outpatient cancer centers of my hospital group, and was starting the research and figuring out how that was going to work. And then COVID hit, and my hospital system asked if I would fill in at the hospitals where the hot spots were. So for really March, April, May, June, I rotated to hospital and served as bedside chaplain there. And of course, all the patients, the isolation, again, I think that's a word we're going to hear over and over, is the isolation. But starting in July, I did start the outpatient chaplaincy program in the cancer center. And the thing that I'm seeing there is just such a loneliness. These patients that are already so vulnerable because most of them are getting chemotherapy treatments, radiation treatments, so they really cannot be exposed to this virus. So they have to come to the treatment alone. No one can come with them. And so many conversations that I've had with them about their own grief of things that they've lost, of being able to see grandchildren, of being able to go anywhere. So they come for treatment and they go home. So I think, again, that isolation is such an issue that we're looking at.
Good.
Yeah, I think on my end, I see a lot of adolescents and emerging adults in my practice. And one of the things we talk about sometimes when kids are experiencing the divorce of their parents is that they can become parentified, in the sense that they start taking responsibility or roles upon themselves that are not developmentally appropriate for them. And they end up being harmed by that in ways that they're not even aware of necessarily, because sometimes they're able to do quite a bit even as teenagers when they're navigating the loss of a mom or a dad, or kind of that family of origin stability that they're used to. And I'm seeing a lot of that with families. Like I know even in my personal family as a parent, like we are internalizing the stress of a system where we have been parentified. So we are asked to make decisions about things that we don't have skill sets or experience to be able to make accurately. I know in my own practice, I'm trying to navigate, should I keep doing teletherapy? Other practitioners are not doing teletherapy. What is the appropriate decision-making module for that? We don't know. And then all of us are trying to figure out, what should I do with my child and as it concerns school? What should I do with my child as it concerns their friends? How should I have my child interact with their vulnerable grandparents or great-grandparents? So right now, all of us, it feels like on my end that people are growing not just tired or isolated or frustrated, but there is this almost kind of rattling exhaustion with, I'm tired of making decisions that I don't actually have a skill set to make. And I can't actually do it anymore. So then some of those things we'd see in teenagers where maybe they're getting drunk and crashing their dad's car through the front of an old Charlie's, or they're stressing themselves out by studying for too long on an exam. Parents are doing that. Adults are doing that. All of us are doing that because, again, we don't have kind of the long-term skill set to navigate some of these larger systemic issues that we're being asked to take care of. I mean, if that makes any sense at all.
Before Kathryn answers, I just want to jump in and ask Eric, one thing that I know that you've written about is that for the first time in your counseling career, you personally identify with almost every person you're talking to. This is not someone else's problem. Suddenly it's also your problem and you're having to help them through that, right?
Yeah, and sometimes I'm usually pretty good at keeping the frame, which is just kind of that pastoral or professional idea of yourself where you're pretending to be in charge and know what's going on. And so, but I mean, in reality, it's very much this sense of having to stop myself all the time and be like, yeah, but did you go out? Where did you, when you went to the grocery store, what did you wear? Like, how many people did you spend time with? You know, you have to catch yourself all of the time. I'm finding that happening with me all the time.
We talk about that at our staff consultation meetings, just that similar feeling of we're all going through the same thing, you know, differently, but yeah, it's hard to know. So, you know, when people are making decisions about, do I fly across the country and attend a big family event when, you know, there's all these personal factors going on, and it's like, gosh, I don't know. I don't know what, I can't tell you what to do. I can explore it with you. I can feel it with you. I can sit in the ambivalence with you, but you're right. We have to manage our own reactions and biases to that. And it's tricky in a way that I haven't experienced before either so far. But yeah, for me, so I work in private practice with adults only, 18 and up pretty much. And symptomatically, tons of sleep issues, lots of bad dreams and nightmares. Again, the isolation and loneliness. I do a lot of work with people who are trauma survivors. And I've noticed that for some of them, the pandemic and all of the racial issues, all of the police killings, all of the political climate issues that are happening right now are just kind of triggering this sense of powerlessness and feeling out of control. And so that's even played out clinically. I've seen with a few of my clients, the force of doing teletherapy. And Eric, I'm with you. I'm only offering teletherapy right now. So some of my clients that, for example, wanted to do EMDR, which is a particular kind of trauma therapy, some are doing it online, some are not comfortable, and they're pretty mad about it. You know, like this changed their plans. And having had, you know, early childhood experiences of extreme trauma, extreme stress, and then now this is imposed on them, it can really just stir up that sense of powerlessness and a lot of feelings of anger and feeling out of control. So I'm seeing that. On a little more positive note, some people are doing okay. You know, I have had some people that because they're here in therapy to address family of origin issues, they're not seeing their families right now. And so I've had a few people even go down from weekly to every other week. Some people are, you know, working from home, and especially the ones that don't necessarily have small children or parents to take care of, that are just kind of free to do their thing. I do have some clients that report feeling better. That's not to say that they're not impacted by the stress that we're all experiencing. That's definitely true. But it is interesting to kind of see how some people are responding, like taking advantage of the opportunity to be home. Now, parents of kids, people who are working from home, like most people are having to do, lots of stress, lots of anxiety around that.
So there's a question that's been asked out of what you were just saying, Kathryn. Are you seeing people who are enjoying the isolation?
Oh yeah.
And is that a dangerous thing?
Yeah, yes and no. So some of my clients with social anxiety are like, this is awesome, I don't have to interact. And I'm like, well, not sure if that's a great thing or not. But yes, I think some are enjoying the less contact. I think even with clients with social anxiety who might kind of like having a pass on having to go to work in person and things like that, we're working to not isolate, to be intentional about connection, because of course that's important. But yes, some people are enjoying that, I would say.
So, Mark, I would add to that, I'm certainly not an addiction or an eating disorder expert or specialist, but both of those have tendencies toward isolation. So my experience, and I do have a few folks that are having difficulty with recovery during this pandemic.
Mm. Yeah. So you all have just touched on the next question I wanted to ask you, and that is, are there any specific groups or kinds of people in your practice who are having more trouble than the average person during this time? In other words, is this affecting some people more severely than others? And if so, what would be the predictors of that?
I know that my wife treats a lot of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and I see a lot of dads that are connected to that, or we see a lot of families that are kind of going through that. And we've found an uptick in some of those anxiety patterns that show up with new parents that'll come along, typically because, you know, you're trying to navigate, especially new parents that don't have children. This is their first one. And so they're trying to navigate a whole world of what does the car seat look like? How do I, make my own baby food? How do I, do everything? And then you're adding to it this other parentified stress of how do we navigate having a child healthily in this kind of environment? What do we do with daycare? What do we do with planning for the future? What kind of future are we going to have? And so we're seeing an uptick in terms of kind of those anxiety and depressive patterns that are showing up in people that are prepartum and postpartum, and I'm even seeing that in some dads pretty frequently.
I would say the elderly have had a really hard time. We have several assisted living, progressive care units near where we are, and they've had lockdowns for weeks at a time where the food was delivered to the room. They couldn't go to the dining room, can't go to church. It's been a major impact for that population. I think they've been very vulnerable.
Doyle, that was the group I was going to say, having seen some that have actually said to me, I'm not sure this is worth it.
Yeah.
This could go on another year, 2 years, and I'm not sure how long I'm going to live.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just go hug my children, hug my grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
Well, another population that we've seen really struggle is adolescents. When there has been family conflict, that is heightened. And then the adolescents don't have their normal outlets for rebellion, for one, but also mainly for socialization and being with friends and getting support. Certainly, we're concerned about those children also who deal with abuse in the home, and know with our partners in the advocacy world that when things started opening up, there was an influx of calls because the kids didn't have their normal outlets for reporting, or there weren't others in their lives who could detect abuse. So definitely with adolescents, on the flip side, seeing parents and teens having to work together and having some extra time together. So we can look at that. But I think for teens especially, and that applies to all of us, but we don't have our normal routines, the coffee shop, just that normal interaction that kind of evens out our experience. So we definitely have had teens who've had even suicidal ideation because of that sense of isolation. So we're hoping that as things shift, they'll have those outlets again.
In addition to that, I've seen a lot of clients who are people of color, particularly Black clients, just in a trauma that's just been perpetuated. And so just that longstanding racial trauma that already exists, and then the pandemic, and then not that it hasn't been happening, but our attention towards all of the killings, sort of this response of like, are people caring? How do I respond? A lot of white people seem to be reading books and exploring our privilege, and can we trust that? White friends are asking them to sort of represent a certain demographic. What is it like to be Black during these times? That's stressful and not super appropriate. And so, how do they respond to white people who are trying to understand systemic racism and privilege and oppression and things like that? Some people of color who are maybe on the earlier end of exploring their racial or ethnic identity development, especially those who are not necessarily Black, are kind of like, okay, this seems important for me to explore. What do I do with this? I'm biracial and I'm not quite sure. Do I have space now? Can I explore this? Or do we need to focus on Black Americans right now because of all the attention needed for Black Lives Matter and things like that? So in general, people of color, I've noticed an increased amount of a particular kind of stress. That could be probably a whole nother webinar, I think. And then, people with disabilities, visible and invisible, do I tell people if I have something? I'm nervous to go out. I'm not sure I want to disclose that. Should I go out in public? What are my boundaries of navigating the world with these particular disabilities that people have? So that's another one. lower income clients, you know, people that supplement their income or perhaps earn their entire income through things like Uber Eats and Favor. They're exposed to people. It's like, okay, do I hop in the car and pick up Uber Eats and feed my family? But then I'm knocking on doors and, you know, going and picking up food, and what's the risk, kind of the, so that's, I've seen that, you know, is being pretty stressful for people. And then vocationally, teachers and administrators right now, that came up in our recent staff consult of, especially right now, of, you know, the risk and the exposure and the differing opinions. Some people want to go back to school. Many people don't want to go back to school in person. You know, those that are in person often feel exposed, particularly depending on age demographics, life space, their own ability status. Or, you know, if you're a teacher and you're working from home and you've got kids in school, that's a lot to juggle. So vocationally, that's one area that we're hearing a lot of stress right now.
Did anyone not answer that question? If you wanted to. So let me say to participants, I'm watching the Q&A, and I know we've got some open questions. Because I'm the one asking the other questions, I know that some of your questions are coming up in a minute. So it's not that I'm putting you off, but we're going to get around to everything that's being asked, for sure. Well, so follow on to, again, the things you all have just said. It seems like this is a time in which it's not just one thing, but there's 3 or 4 things that are like stacked on top of each other that are stressors to us. Certainly there's COVID, and there's the racial reckoning issue, there's the election season, there's the economy, and now we've got wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, and we've got hurricanes in the Gulf. And, you know, it's my favorite meme of the week was, you've seen this one going around, that says, you might as well start pronouncing the L in salmon because nothing matters anymore, right? Just give it all up, no decorum. It's all for naught. How do you see the cumulative effect of these things? And are they related in some way, or is it just that they've stacked up?
You know, Doyle said something interesting first time around when he mentioned that if you have a pre-existing condition, it's worse. And I think that that's true, even if we're talking about systemically. Like if you have a pre-existing condition, COVID makes it worse. So we're talking politically, it makes it worse. Economically, it makes it worse. Sociologically, it makes it worse. So I think that one of the great frustrations that I'm experiencing is that it regularly in 2020, it feels like one thing that holds true is that we are still in competition with each other. So it's almost like instead of practicing that sense of intersectionality, like Kathryn's talking about, or like a lot of Ibram Kendi's work is about, and how to be an anti-racist, but also stand from the beginning. It's instead of partnering with each other and understanding kind of the shared struggle and solidarity of trying to be alive right now, we are constantly in competition with each other for representation, which is, again, I understand the necessity of that, but we're in competition politically, we're in competition economically. And then even in this kind of environment, even as mental health providers, I find myself constantly in competition with the question of, you know, should I be seeing people in person? You know, like what's going on at the practice next door? What are they doing? So, you know, all of us are kind of, again, have this internalized sense of there is no solidarity, there is only scarcity. And so I think that for me feels like the cascading kind of compounding effect of all of this is that I'm never at rest, and neither are any of the patients I see, whether they're students in the low-income high school that I serve, or they're well-to-do families in another part of town that I see privately. It's this constant nature of kind of struggle and competition and scarcity that we're all kind of navigating. But I don't know if I'm answering your question, but.
Yep.
In many ways, it's magnified the existential fact that we're never in control. Anytime we face an individual crisis, that's what hits us, whether it be finding out a loved one is dealing with addiction, whether it be a health crisis. It reminds us we're not in control. And so whatever is happening with the illness, with the pandemic, with COVID, with the weather, we're not in control. And we're all seeing that at the same time. We also always, and this is our human state, we have difficulty having empathy and understanding the view of others, because we're so in tune with our own perspective. And so again, that's always been there, that need to have empathy, that need to truly seek to understand the other. And so it's, to me, interesting how this has just uncovered those things. I know hopefully in our conversation we'll get how to help people through that. But just that issue of we are not in control. In many ways, that's the first step to healing. So we can hopefully talk more about how to help as we go along too.
Well, so this is, just I have to interject, this is set up like a good evangelistic sermon. The first part of this is to make you feel really bad about the world and understand how sinful you are before we get to the redemption in the second part.
I can do most doom and gloom heavy lifting here, everybody. I'm fine.
Stay tuned.
We are a Baptist organization, after all. Yeah.
We'll save the positivity for the end.
Yes.
So just on that note,
Lots of positivity, that's fine, yes.
on that note of control, Brad, that you mentioned, to me, it's very interesting what's happening right now with the interest in QAnon and various conspiracy theories. And I really do believe that that stems from our need for control and to feel special and to go down a rabbit hole. And, you know, people are home for hours and hours. Now, some very busy and stressed, some, you know, needing an escape, you know, having different reactions. And it is really interesting that I've noticed this sort of issue with control of like, oh, well, if I believe that this particular thing caused the pandemic, or it's not really real, or masks don't really work or something, then that gives me a semblance of control. I can perhaps excuse my behaviors, or hitch my hat to a reason that this is happening to make it not so bad, because you're right, it is an existential issue that we are just having to deal with. None of us opted into any of these issues that, Mark, that you pointed out, all the politics and social and political and the pandemic and everything, the election that's coming up and everything that's going on. People are needing some kind of escape and sense of control. So kind of a side note with my interest in cult studies and those kinds of things, where there's a lot of talk in those networks around conspiracy theories, quite frankly, and kind of what they're doing for people and how people are kind of getting sucked into that.
Interesting connection. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm seeing, and I just keep naming it, this is the grief. People are grieving the things that the normal things, the things that they would do in life. The 4th of July picnic that never happened. I had a patient the other day said, I feel like it's still March because there are these markers in my life that I didn't get to do. And I was able to talk with them about just grieving those things that you did. You missed those things. You missed a child's birthday. You missed something that was so much a part of the joy that you have. And to just grieve and let yourself grieve that.
Mm. Anyone else on that one?
Well, I guess I have another thought too, just to add, is that all of those issues that were mentioned could sort of be looked at through their own lenses at each one of the other issues. You know, how has the pandemic impacted people's response to Black Lives Matter? How has that impacted people's political views and activism? And the wildfire now, you know, depending on where people are politically or geographically, you know, there's just a lot going on. It's kind of like a prism. You can look at all those issues on their own and also how they intersect with each other. So I definitely think it's a pile-on effect that we need to consider how they all interact.
So I was telling some of y'all before we started tonight, earlier today I was interviewing a well-known church consultant about some of these same things as it goes to church leadership. And she said, from her perspective, these things are not unrelated, in that with the pandemic in particular, once you lose your footing with that, once you start questioning everything, suddenly you're able to see and hear things that have been right in front of you all along, but you weren't open to hear, right? And I suspect that's a lot like what happens for a lot of us in therapy is you maybe go in with problem A and suddenly discover that once you lay problem A on the table, you're suddenly aware there's a problem B, C, and D as well. Is that a fair assessment?
Sure. Problem A might be easier to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can talk with a pastor or a therapist about problem A, you can test the waters and see, well, maybe I can talk about B and C.
Sure. Well, now this is the point in the sermon which we're going to turn a little bit to the Jesus part. You know, so we would sing a hymn here to get us turned just a little bit in the right direction. I want to begin by asking, not for an easy answer on anything, because I think one of the things that's driving some of us crazy right now is people who are just spouting platitudes. And I know pastors are dealing with this, where congregants are saying, well, you just need to pray more, or you just need to trust God more, or you just need to have more faith, and you're going to get through this. Let me give you my bumper sticker to put on your car or on your mirror so that will help you feel better. Oh, I'll give you this scripture verse that you can put on your mirror and see every morning, and you can praise God and be happy. How do we get beyond that?
I really like that question for a lot of reasons, because I love the doom and gloom part of the sermon. I'm not very good at the back end, but no. But for me, there's a psychologist I really love, and his name is Bruce Rogers Vaughn, and he teaches at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and he's written several just beautiful articles on pastoral theology and pastoral care. He has one book in particular called "Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age." If this is just a commercial for him, I'm fine. I'm not getting any payment for this. He's a genius, though. But he wrote a couple articles. One was called "Blessed Are Those Who Mourn: Depression as Political Resistance," and another article was called "Grief Recovery or the Recovery of Grief." And so in both of these articles, what he's arguing and what he later argues in Caring for Souls is this concept of using religion as a way of uncovering the need for listening to our pain and giving us a language and an understanding and terminology that makes sense to us. So rather than clinically pathologizing our pain or suppressing it or ignoring it with platitudes like you're talking about, or bumper stickering it right over our mouths, that instead he's asking for us to actually listen to empathize with our pain for a moment and understand how it's trying to be helpful for us. Like, how is it trying to talk to us about how the world is a profoundly inhumane and unlivable hellscape right now? And so if we don't acknowledge the reality of that, then there aren't any platitudes. There aren't any things that are very helpful for us. And that he's arguing then on the back end that if we can recover how to grieve, like Grace is talking about here, that we get a chance to actually practice our religion by having faith in a profound moment where we don't actually believe in anything, or we're not sure that we do. And that we might find in the absence of our faith for a moment that there is actually a God, and it's not just a bumper sticker at the end of that. So that's me sermonizing a little bit on the back end of Bruce. I don't think he would say all of that, but I do think his work is really helpful right now, because it gives people a freedom to say, you shouldn't be okay right now. Like, you should be doing poorly. It's terrible. And so what is your depression teaching you about how this doesn't work for you? Because we should probably listen to it for a second before we medicate it or ask it to do other things.
Wow, that's a great sermon.
Thanks. Sir, you can just, I think can we list Venmo in the chat box, or what's the?
I didn't think about making
That's a joke. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Someone else on that question?
Well, Ken Pepper used to have this expression of teaching clients to listen to their depression. And what can your depression teach you that can help you understand yourself, other, God better? So it's a way of like welcoming or listening to, embracing, and respecting these things that are going on in our lives. And I think we need to listen a lot more than we're talking. And just listen. That's my thought.
I have been encouraged by some churches being more vocal about the issue of mental health and talking about the fact that it's okay to not be okay. I also have really been thinking about the helpers, which I'm sure on this Zoom call, many who are listening in are helpers. And so I think one way that we can keep from only distributing, sharing empty or shallow platitudes is to make sure we're taking care of ourselves, making sure that we are listening to our own depression and our own anxiety. I've been really concerned about our therapists. They've got full days, full caseloads. There is a energy that's different, that's required via telecounseling. And I think of the same thing with Stephen ministers wanting to be able to help, but not knowing how they can. So bottom line, I think we can make sure that we're providing genuine support by also taking care of ourselves.
I want to jump in for just a minute before we move on for others to answer that question and piggyback on what Brad said. We have a number of Stephen ministers on the call with us tonight who are particularly tuning in to get some skills and help on this. And if your congregation is not familiar with Stephen ministry, I just want to highly recommend it as a lay ministry tool. As someone who has just come out of 17 years in a pastoral role, I will tell you that having able Stephen ministers in the congregation was a lifesaver to all of us on staff, because these trained lay people are able to do so much good, so that it's almost like the biblical role of a deacon, in a sense. It's really a lot of good. And so thank you to all of our Stephen ministers who are joining us here. Now, who's next on that question?
I'll jump in. I think it was Thursday morning last week. I go to work really early and I was driving in the dark, and I just felt this knot inside of me. And it's going back, Brad, to what you were saying. I realized I hadn't let myself deal with any of what was going on. And to be able to get to where I was going and just sit and be quiet and be still and try to dig into where that anxiety, that was finally what I named it. It was just an anxiousness. And Mark, to be able to list those things that you just said, of just stack them on top of each other, and then deal with, 2 young adult sons. Are they being careful? Are they doing what they're supposed to? An 89-year-old mother-in-law who is so by herself. The things that we try to care for others, but going back to what Brad said of caring for ourselves. And I would say that to the people on the call, of we have to be able to care for ourselves before we can care for others.
So Grace, if I can interrupt again, you said something that really is, in a way, an answer to an important comment that's been made on the Q&A, and that is how important it is to name the demons that are troubling folks today, to name them one by one. This is not count your many blessings. This is count your many demons. The racism, the pushback to racism, the misogyny, the bad words, the lack of health care, the
self-centeredness.
You just go down the list of all these things. And I think what you're saying is it's important to just name them. And,
yes.
Right?
And for me, it's to take my journal and write them, give them words, write them down on a piece of paper. And it helped when I was doing that to almost let go of some of it, to help me know why I was feeling this knot in my gut. And, things as simple as sleep. Kathryn, I think it was you saying sleep, people are having bad dreams. And I've read a good bit about that all of, especially the pandemic and worrying about that, does impact your sleep. So that was one of mine that day, was I hadn't slept well. So to be able to not just the huge things that are impacting our nation and our world, but what's just impacting me here in my house, my family, my little brood right here.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that came to mind with what Eric, what you had mentioned about, and Doyle as well, about kind of letting the depression speak to you. What is it trying to say? Being really curious about that. And then with the question about how do we sort of lose the religious platitudes, and this is a psychologist, not a minister. I do not have a ministry background, disclaimer there, but losing kind of the religious platitudes in the spiritual abuse and religious trauma sort of networks and conversations that I'm involved with. There's this idea of spiritual bypassing as a tool to sort of skip the hard things, you know? So like you were saying, Grace, with that anxiety that you noticed, rather than skipping over it and saying, oh, I'll just give it to God or pray more or something along those lines, I'm going to sit in it and write about it and really feel it. And so I think for ourselves, just like you said, Brad, you know, doing our own work and our own self-care, for ourselves as well as for others, if it feels like we're skipping things, you know, because they're hard, that might be a helpful little red flag to kind of invite us to go back to be curious and explore what is that thing or things that are so uncomfortable that we just want to bypass them. And doing it religiously is very socially acceptable. You know, I'm just going to pray about it or give a platitude or it'll be okay. God's in charge. Okay. And yet that doesn't mean that there's not pain that we really need to sit with and deal with.
One of the questions that's been asked, the comment/question, goes straight to this as well that some of y'all might want to address. And that is struggling with intrusive thoughts of good memories from the days when things were good. And, you know, which seems like so long ago, right? And I know all of us deal with this difficulty, I think, every week of, well, I wish it were back, you know, 6 months ago when I could do the things that I wish. How do we hold those things at bay and not be controlled by them? Anyone?
We're all good at the therapeutic silence, so just so you know.
Am I supposed to answer my own question?
We can outlast anyone. It's true. It's true. I think I'm just, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think I'm just sitting with that question. It's a really good question. And without a ton of context, it's hard to say, you know, without that personal context. But I think holding what is true, kind of that dialectic, things used to be good and they're not good now. And really exploring and kind of acknowledging that and exploring, well, what does that mean? Is that when you say that those thoughts are intrusive, is it a fear and panic that things might never return? What is that about for you? I would wonder. And give air to those thoughts, you know, process them out loud, explore them, feel what your body is carrying with them, what emotions are traveling with those thoughts, to kind of contextualize them a bit and validate them. And I think, Grace, you had mentioned that grief piece, and I wonder if that might be what's going on with many of us, quite frankly, you know, who are thinking about the past and when things are better, sitting in that grief and all that brings up, and then kind of that meaning making piece of, well, what does this mean now? What might this mean in the future? I think I saw part of that question. So there were some really good years. Well, how are things now, and how can I kind of carry those good memories with me into the future?
Yeah, I would say from my own experience, the pastoral experience, and dealing with others, anytime we're in a difficult phase of life, we remember the things that were good from before. It just seems like a very common thing to do, to have a nostalgic love and desire for things to be the way they once were, right? And as someone who lives with a long-term injury, I find that to be true as well, because you're just always wistful for the way things used to be. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think we're all in that phase right now.
You know, I don't want to sound like I'm sharing a platitude, but being grateful for what is happening. It sounds trite, but I do believe in that. So I miss all of our staff being around and walking down the hallway and chatting. I miss driving to a workshop and talking with people before giving the talk. So I have similar wishes for things being what they were, being able to travel normally. But at the same time, how can we find connection even in these circumstances? For those we lead, how can we also still instill hope? I wrote an email to our staff today, and I told them I'm burdened by all of the pain that you're seeing, but I still have hope that we'll connect again and we'll be able to support each other again. So whatever the pressure point or pain point, how can we turn that into a new normal? How can we connect in a new or different way? But then we also get back to the fact of life is ever changing and we can't control it. And we have to adapt to whatever it is at that moment. And hopefully we can be like the Apostle Paul and be content in all circumstances. Sorry if that sounds like a platitude, but being content. Perhaps we are learning to be more comfortable with ourselves and not having the busyness of life. So that last thought is, what good is coming out of this? How can we be different in a good way?
So you guys are heading straight into the next question on this, and several people are asking this in the chat as well. They're asking in different ways. I'm going to ask it this way and say, what are some of the best practices that you see happening, or what's some of the best advice you've given people that might benefit someone else? Or another person said, how can we foster hope in a time of despair? So this is the salvation part of the sermon here, right? We're warming up for the altar call in just a few minutes. How can we do something positive out of this?
Community comes to my mind. We are finding different ways to relate and connect, and it's through Zoom. I said a couple of years ago I would never do telemental health, and that's what I'm doing all day, every day. And so I think churches have to find ways to stay connected, and pastors are feeling so much stress about that. How are we going to stay afloat financially when people aren't here physically? Are they going to continue to contribute financially? So pastors are extremely stressed right now. And if any pastors are listening today, I hope that you will hear some of the things we're talking about self-care and acknowledging that you need support. You need a shepherd and a pastor. So community, I would say community is our hope. It's defined differently. Right.
So one of the things I keep telling people is Zoom church and Sunday school and small group and everything works for a time because we have a relationship in the real world before that.
Right.
Right. And so we can have this conversation because I know you somewhere else. It becomes, I think, very hard for people to jump in to that when they don't have the real world experience, although people are doing it as well. What are some other pro tips from y'all?
I liked reading through some of the Q&A stuff, and there's someone here at the bottom saying, is it wrong to remember the good old days? Or is that part of the comfort or grief process? Sometimes our memories are not really so accurate. And I liked what some of the other folks were saying when they were talking about, really sitting with, even when we're remembering the stuff that we miss, and sitting with the idea of the truthfulness about, like, what did that stuff say about us as a person? When we're remembering kind of our connections with other people, when we're remembering these certain components of our jobs that we've lost, when we're remembering that we used to see people in person and get to have that experience ourselves. What did that say about us as, in my case, as a therapist or as a pastor or as a friend or as a neighbor or as a Sunday school member or, whatever version of ourselves. And I think like trying to really, like Kathryn was saying, just sit in that idea for a second so that we can figure out what exactly are we afraid of losing here. Because I think at the core, it's like something about your identity, like your sense of self and your sense of safety. Like maybe you're losing that sense of like, oh, like I'm purposeless. Like I'm hopeless. Like I don't have, like I'm worthless. Like if I don't have a productive end to my life, then do I really exist at all? Like if I'm no longer making a thing that exists in the world, do I exist in the world? You know, and that's getting a bit existential, but I think at the bottom of it, what we're asking people to do is take the opportunity to sit for a moment in what part of your identity is going to still stick around here. That's not actually up for grabs, that like this version of yourself might be up for grabs, or the way in which that identity was taking shape in the old world might be up for grabs. But what's actually true about you as a person? That you're loved, that you're known, that you have people checking in on you, that you have work that's meaningful, that we still get to do it, even though it doesn't look quite the same. I think some of those things are a way that I've found of trying to move people out of this 30,000 foot deprivation, sort of the world is ending, and into who actually are you as a person and what's going on right now. And I think right out of grad school, I used to work with a lot of people in addiction. And one of the things that we would say is, what's the next right thing? Not like 15 months from now, not like 5 years from now, and that's hard for us to do that right now. Not even like 15 minutes from now, but it's like 15 seconds from now. What's the next right thing? Who do you need to be calling? Who do you need to be connected to? What do you need to be doing with yourself? When did you go outside? When have you eaten today? Have you had those sweatpants on every day, or is it just like every other? What's the rotation there? Like some of those things, like it's just like keeping yourself fed and watered, man. And I think like when we're doing that kind of work, then we can like kind of re-engage that part of our brain we need to be a little bit more creative. But if we don't do that, if we're just screaming all day in sweatpants at the internet, like having this idea that we're going to be an empathic society, that seems like a long shot to me.
Good sermon again. Thank you.
Amen.
And to tag on to that, a practical way to do that for people who like the practical pieces here, none of us have lived through what we're living through right now, but we've all lived through some kind of adversity. So take yourself back to that time, and that this tags into, Eric, to your point about identity. How did you get through that? What did you do? How did you care for yourself? What does that mean about you? What does that say about who you are as a human being? How does that apply now? And then how might that apply as we continue, as this has shifted from acute to chronic, you know? So in the past, how have you dealt with adversity, and how do you want to kind of carry that forward?
So that's a really important point you just made. This has shifted from acute to chronic. What we thought in the beginning was going to be a short-term inconvenience has turned out to be a pretty long-term nuisance.
Yep. And I imagine some of you all have seen similarly. I've seen that with some clients who, you know, March 16th, I think, is about when I went online. And some of my clients, no, I'll just catch you when this is over in person. I don't want to meet online. A month, 2 months, 3 months, you know, depending on the client's time goes by, I'm getting a phone call. Hey, can I see you online now? You know, this is going on a lot longer than any of us ever anticipated, or some of us, I should say.
Also at a practical level, we work a lot with families, and it seems so simple, but problem solving really is a core skill to well-being. When we're depressed, we're so narrowly focused, we can't see the options, we can't see the different ways to handle a problem. So whether it be deciding whether our kid is in person or not, deciding about their friendships and hanging out with friends, as Eric was saying, look at all the options, look at all the possibilities. We start by identifying what the problem is, or what we can change or control, and then find the best way to work within that. I still say accepting the fact that there will be uncertainty is what is key to having the mindset to get through it. But then we also can recognize there are areas that we can figure things out. And so from there, we are problem solving. And then that does lead to a greater value, and that is resilience. That, as Kathryn was saying, and it is sort of like the psalmist who would talk about being in the pit and can't get out of the pit, but then remembering God's provision in the past, and then remembering that can happen again. I think we can look back to troubles, challenges we've had, and see how we work through those, and have confidence and hope that we can work through this current challenge.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite seminary professors was Frank Tupper, and one of his quotes that I still remember all these years later was, "Hopelessness is when you can no longer remember the last time you had hope." And I know it's not the same, but it's somewhat of, yes, let's remember what we did have and let's look forward to where we're going. One of the things that I've found in my own life and with some of the people I work with is if we can do things that don't make us think about this all the time, to go do something, quote, normal, go ride your bike, go work in your garden, do things that are the same as they were before March 16th, as Kathryn said.
Yeah.
And with that piece of, with depression, our brain just kind of zooms in on the negative and filters out the positive. Sometimes kicking into a behavioral gear is just very practical. So whether it's sleep schedules, having rituals and routines can be helpful. You know, at the end of the day, have your walk with your dog, or your glass of wine, or your I don't know, your yoga practice or your bath, whatever that is, and kind of building that into that routine. So you're sort of orienting around a new normal, trusting that with those behavioral changes, if we make behavior changes, that does impact our emotions and it impacts our thoughts as well. And that can be a way to help with that. And then behaviorally as well, monitoring social media intake, monitoring media intake, checking your sources on the news. That's a whole different issue that we haven't completely fleshed out in this webinar, but how the news is impacting people, you know, so let yourself kind of filter down what you think you can handle that day. I know for me personally, there's days that I just can only take so much, and I'll just kind of catch up in a few days when I have more capacity. Just we're all juggling so many different things, but that takes some self-awareness, and again, checking in with how you're doing emotionally and what your body is telling you as far as when you're pushing yourself to those limits. So I think those behavioral pieces can be really helpful in terms of making some changes and hooking on to that hope.
Again, thinking about those who are likely on the call being helpers, Stephen ministers, it's okay to take care of yourself and recognize that depression, and remember, I know again it's basic, but we take it for granted. There are biochemical factors to depression. We look for intensity and duration of the symptoms. So things may be a little bit more complex now, but when in doubt, reach out. And I know it would be obvious, I would say this as a leader of a counseling center, but be open to counseling, be open to self-reflection, be open to learning about yourself. But if 20% of Americans any given year deal with depression or anxiety, we've got to be aware that that could be us, and that a lingering worry can be anxiety over time, and it can be more than just a worry or a sadness. So be open to talking about it. I would think those on this call are already interested in mental health, but I just want to say that thinking about those who may be listening.
Before we get to our last two questions, I want to take a brief pause and make a personal comment, particularly to anyone who's joining us tonight or who's watching this later, who is feeling in any way suicidal through these times. I'm someone who's been where you are right now, and I understand a little bit about what you're feeling. And if you're in that position, we're all saying to you tonight, we want you to live. And one of the things that helped me get through that was to discover that, to borrow a phrase, where I thought life had dealt me a period to my sentence. It was actually a semicolon. And there's more to the story to be told. And I think in times like these, from my experience, we think things have reached the end because we can't envision more of the story happening, even if it's just that the story is going to be very different than it was before. One of the people who's joining us tonight in the audience, the attendees, is the person who had the courage to say to me, would you promise me that if you plan on harming yourself, you would call me first? And any one of us can be that person. So even if you're not the one who is suicidal, if you know someone who you suspect is, I would encourage you to reach out and be bold. Take a risk. It's worth it, right? I was not offended in that moment. I was undone. And everyone participating in this webinar tonight has the potential, I think, to help someone live. And that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation tonight. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
How do you see the long-term effects of all this? I mean, yeah, we're going to get out of COVID-19 someday. We don't know when. What's going to be on the other side? And not only what damage will have been done, but what will be the residual stuff that you think we'll be dealing with down the line? While you're thinking, I think part of the myth that we all have is that there's going to come a day in which we're all just back to normal, right? And we'll just put this all behind us and we'll move on. But I suspect it's maybe not that simple.
I think we're vocalizing or not vocalizing where everybody is. We just don't know. And that's a part of the uncertainty. So the question is, how will this impact us for ongoing, right?
Yes.
I'm concerned about what I anticipate. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm concerned about mental health issues. I'm concerned about addiction issues, family abuse issues. I think I'm concerned about all these things. So the problems that we had before COVID-19 will be problems that we will have afterwards.
And Doyle, you got it. Someone asked the question: have abuse rates gone up during the pandemic?
I would say yes, but Kathryn, you know anything about that?
They have, from what I have heard, they have. People that I know that work in domestic violence shelters are reporting increased calls. Police departments are reporting increased calls for DV. It's pretty sad, but yes, that is happening.
Yeah, Brad, do you have anything to add to that maybe?
Yes, I was looking up some research earlier. I always want to focus on data that is out there. I know anecdotally, and just in the culture, we hear about more drinking. As far as abuse goes, I think definitely we can see and track an uptick. What I'm interested to see is the trends related to suicide, suicidality, as well as addiction. So that, Mark, is one answer. What are we going to see going into the future? And that can be the development of negative coping skills like substance abuse. So that could be something that is progressive. I think that I still, and sorry to go back to the moving to the altar call, but hopefully there can be some positive things that are coming out of this.
Wow.
And those would be that there is more talk about mental health. I have seen it on the news. I've been doing more news interviews than I've ever done. And so there's more talk about mental health. Hopefully that can continue. Of course, an open dialogue about race is another positive. Perhaps, and maybe I'm too optimistic, but perhaps a shifting in values and the importance of connecting, that perhaps we took in-person connection for granted, and maybe we can see more of the value in that and more of a focus on family, work, life balance. So hopefully those are some positive things that this can all lead to.
Good.
One of the things that and it's probably just, I'm a collaborative therapist. So when I don't have a good answer, I just ask the person who asked it. And they usually help me out. But I think for all of us, when I look at the panel, it seems like we probably all have, like, not the exact same experience, but a pretty shared one. And so I think that sometimes if we're talking about how do we survive a uncertain and violent and confusing future, we should ask people who have lived in oppression for a long time. how best to survive that kind of world, because they are in fact experts at it. So for me, like when you're a church and you're a church that has traditionally enjoyed quite a bit of funding and security and stability, and now you're finding yourself bereft of those things, maybe you should ask pastors who have been working 2 jobs and keeping their church afloat how they best do it. And for me, I think the same can be true of folks that we're seeing in our offices, or folks that have been living in our communities for a long time, just scrapping out there. How have they been doing it? How have you been taking care of yourself in the midst of taking care of your children, in the midst of working a demanding work schedule, in the midst of navigating social services that are confusing and altogether not very beneficent? Have you lived in those kinds of environments? Can you help me understand how best to do that for myself and for our communities? So I think if we're going to start centering voices who have been oppressed, we should probably listen to them when we're talking about what kind of future do we live in now if we are, all of us, enduring oppression from a virus, from an uncertain future, from all these sorts of things. And I think for me, like that's been really liberating, is to talk to students of color and students who are across the socioeconomic spectrum and ask them, hey, when you think about the future, what does it look like for you? Like, how do you make sense of this? Because their answers often help me way more than mine do theirs.
Mark, I was in a webinar today with about 30 therapists, and one of the therapists made an interesting comment to the church. He said, I'm not a minister, but I wish that clergy, men and women clergy, would normalize from the pulpit verbally, it's okay to talk to a professional to get help. And the comment that this person was making was, there's still a strong stigma to talk with people about personal matters.
Well said.
So with the long-term effects and the silence that evoked, I think I agree, Brad, that that's pretty telling. I think I'm kind of anticipating, I don't think it's hard to say. There's a lot that's coming up with the election and other cultural pieces. You know, I fear that some of what's happening right now will just increase the gap between people in lower SES, increase the wage gap and the kind of class gap there. I hope and wonder if, you know, Eric, to your point, as we collaborate and listen to people, that we can respond in such a way that rather than perpetuating all of that generational and systemic trauma, that we could start to build together and heal. I don't know what that's going to look like. And I think that's why the question is hard to really sit with, because there's a lot of us and we're all having different reactions, different responses here. My hope is that that will happen. I hope not to continue that perpetuation of that kind of trauma, and we will see what happens. On a brighter note, there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth. We know from experience with our clients, we know from the literature, people can grow from trauma. I know, Mark, you've shared a lot about your own personal journeys, and I see that in you. You know, those who've been through various kinds of traumas and who are able to sit with that and make meaning of that and heal from that can grow and have a kind of wisdom and resilience after that they may not have had before. And so I also hope for that there's an element of us who are able to grow from these really trying times.
Thank you, Kathryn. I think that's a beautiful comment. And I would just thank you for that affirmation. I think the thing that those of us who've come through anything would tell you is what happens on the other side is not what was on the front side. It's different, but it's okay. And I think that's what Eric was trying to say earlier. In a way as well.
That's right? not being very successful, but trying.
Not that we were greatly successful with that, but we are in a time of transition. And if we think we're going to go back to the way things were entirely, that's not really a good answer.
No, it's not.
Well, this is, I mean, if we're going to get real platitudey about it, I think this is when the resurrection becomes terribly helpful for us, right? Like, you know, if we're, especially when we're talking about suicidality, and people who have gotten pretty close. I think that in my experience with patients or clients, it's been, if they have a Christian tradition that makes sense to them, resurrection ends up being something that's terribly powerful, whereas before it was this weird add-on that they weren't quite sure what to do with in terms of a theological belief. But then once you've experienced, oh, there's this kind of thing where I'm not quite dead, but I'm also alive, and I have scars, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with that, but I see the world differently, and I'm a different kind of person, and people notice that, but they're also not sure how to put words to it. Man, the resurrection can be terribly helpful for that.
Beautiful.
Good point.
So
just simplistic is so many things. And Brad, I think you said there's so many things that hopefully we will cherish more and value and be thankful for, that are even happening now, that families are spending more time together. And that one day we'll be able to hug some of those that we haven't been able to hug, and be close to those that we haven't been able to be close to.
Let me close with this thought, and feel free to comment on this as well. One of the questions that's outstanding is about how to train volunteers. If you're, say, a church leader and you're wanting to train other people to help extend the care. I know a lot of churches have done calling trees, and maybe dividing up groups to check on a certain number of people and so forth. But one of the things I'm hearing that's helpful to people right now is a return to a focus on spiritual practices. In fact, I was speaking to someone today who said, there's some basic spiritual practices that we've fallen away from because we've been pursuing growth or organizational charts or whatever, instead of focusing on not the platitudinous kind of prayer, but different prayer disciplines, or walking a labyrinth, or reading devotional material in a certain way, or a focused prayer time, or some other thing that you do that combines these things. There's a really fascinating article on our website. If you go to the B&G website and type in spiritual practices, you'll come up with several things from articles we published in the past. One of them was an article written by Jane Davis from Wilmington, North Carolina, on the spiritual discipline of stacking stones. And I encourage you to go find that piece on our site. It's had a resurgence lately, but it's about something very simple that is a way to maybe create a memorial to a time, right? Any other spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices you would highlight that might be out of our mind but would be helpful to know?
I think journaling for sure can be one. Writing down our thoughts and feelings each day is a way to memorialize our growth process, and also admit the grief, but then have also that portion that we write about what we're hoping for.
I was going to say the tradition of the welcoming prayer. I kind of alluded to it earlier, where you welcome in your consciousness and your mindfulness, your depression or anxiety, and you listen to it and you respect it, and you try to see it as an opportunity for learning and a laboratory for growth.
I really like a non-productive Sabbath. I understand that, when we've all been trapped at home and not physically going to church, that's probably a tough take. But I think helping people kind of embrace and or start putting thoughtfulness behind the fact that they're not attending church and what is left of their spirituality on the other side of that. And I think some of us have this idea that our spirituality is mostly performative, or it's, institutionally or corporately driven. And so I think then for us, it's cool to then pivot. So what does it mean then for your Sabbath to look like an actual practice that you undertake, where even if you're in the same space, how do you order the space differently? How do you track the day? Like even some of the things that Kathryn was talking about, how do you schedule yourself? Like if we're going to get down to real pure behaviorism, what does your day look like? And can you structure a day where you actually get to practice Sabbath, even if it's in the same place as you've been living all week? And what does it mean to not be productive in that space, or to not be anxious in that space, or to just kind of rest in that space? Like, what does it actually look like? I think some of that might be helpful for folks.
Beautiful.
I think to tag on to that is just to be still and quiet. I think in this day with electronics and phones and all the things we have that are right here around us, just to put all of that away. For me, it's to sit out on my back porch, not take any of that out there with me. And Mark, listen to some of those birds that we can now hear.
Yeah.
And just, just let the holy speak to you.
I've started walking the same path almost every day.
Yeah.
In a park near our house. And my intent was to be sort of like Monet's garden that he painted over and over and over again. And so 6 months in, I've been through half a year of seasons. Now, granted, in Texas, that's basically one season. But even there, I've made myself look for signs of life, even in the heat of the summer. And I've found the beautiful little blooms and blossoms on weeds. And they're beautiful and they're fascinating. And I've seen I've seen butterflies, and I've seen grasshoppers, and I've seen dragonflies. And every day is just a little bit different. And for someone who's restless like me, this is like forcing myself to do this, right? But it has become for me a spiritual discipline like this as well. And maybe there's something that you'll find that would be that for you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank all our panelists for the outstanding conversation. And if any of you would like to get in touch with any of them, particularly, you're welcome to email me, and I'll be glad to pass that on. My email address is mark, M-A-R-K, @baptistnews.com. mark@baptistnews.com. And we will be posting the video of this a little bit later once we trim it down just a touch, all my jabbering at the beginning and so forth. I'm so grateful to each of you for being part of this. We've had about 80 people online in and out or so tonight, and many more will be reached later through this as well. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you for your beautiful answers. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you very much.
Take care.